Welcome to another episode of Top Lines and Tails in our series Characters in Livestock. We are this week, as always, sponsored by Harbro, manufacturers and suppliers of quality livestock nutrition. And still looking at characters in livestock, this week we have a rather unique guest who's made his mark on both sides of the Atlantic. Gordon Phillip from Kansas City. Gordon, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, and thanks for having me from someone from the Hill of Mormon in Aberdeenshire. I'm honored.
Well, Gordon, I know that now in your later years you've earned massive respect in the USA cattle business, but your roots are in Scotland, as you just mentioned. And tell us a bit more about where you were born in Scotland and what was your time like as a young man there?
I grew up in Strichen. Went to school there. Strichen's about 36 miles north of Aberdeen and 6 miles from the wild North Sea. Sometimes we get a taste of salt water in our lips when we're setting up wet stooks. And I grew up soon after the war, of course, and it was pretty tough times back then. I was 6 in a family of 7, and I knew that I would have to go somewhere sometime down the road.
Okay, well, this podcast tends to draw a lot of audiences, either from the UK and particularly Scotland, or from the USA, but I'm not sure we've had one guest on that warrants so much interest from both sides of the pond before. So let's assume that when you're talking about Scotland, that you give us enough detail that the Americans will understand it, and vice versa, I guess, so that we can cover both cases.
Well, I can tell you that where I grew up was about as far north as Juneau, Alaska, halfway up Hudson Bay. And back then we had hellacious storms compared to what we have today. We would go out sometimes and probe for a sheep flock with long sticks
in the snow.
And let me tell you, I was glad. I was thinking I'd go to Australia where the sun shines most of the time, but I finished up in the United States. And I was involved, of course, at the early age. Started showing lambs at about 9, 10 years old at the Stricken show. I remember the Achy Fair very well, big long strings at Clydesdales lined up there for the Clydesdale market because everything was handled by horses back then. We didn't get our first tractor in, and Alice Chalmers came in a convoy from America, I'm sure. Wouldn't have come from anywhere else. Yeah. But unfortunately, 3,600 ships were sunk by the submarines, by the Germans that were bringing material and different things. Roosevelt was supporting Britain very heavily at the time, and we were lucky to get a tractor in the late 40s, I think. The 50s, of course, I was getting into showing cattle. My father showed Clydesdale. His best saying was, "Fat's a pretty color," and I soon learned that you'd better have cattle or sheep or horses in condition if you were going to be marketing them.
That's very good.
And he was a good instructor in that area. I was very lucky to have wonderful parents when I grew up, and always encouraged me to do whatever I wanted to do. I was fitting and showing cattle for people all over the Northeast, basically, before I got into the registered program.
Okay. And when we call a registered program, there's a couple of course, shortcuts in the livestock world in Scotland, one of those being, of course, the Scottish Young Farmers Organisation, who are a fantastic institution. And I gather you would be involved in young farmers from an early age, Gordon.
I was indeed. I was lucky enough to represent the Scotland in some of the international competitions. And the Scottish Young Farmers Association was a huge, it allowed you to meet people all over the country, and it allowed you to, if you wanted to, you could advance your knowledge on and meet so many of the cattle breeders around. And I was winning a lot of the different shows, judging competitions and the young farmers, and met a lot of wonderful people there.
We also have on the call one of our good old favourites and friends here, Dr. Bob Hoke. Bob, welcome to the call there, and just dive in there and give your understanding of how the Young Farmers Movement compares maybe to what you guys have in the university in the US.
Well, I mean, that's what I was just going to ask, because, I grew up with FFA, and it made Future Farmers of America, and it made a huge difference in my life. But, Gordon, I was involved with National 4-H judging contest for about 24 years over here. And I was wondering, do you ever officiate any of the judging contests over here? Were you at American Royal or anything?
Oh, back in the 60s, of course, when I came over here, yes, I was very much involved in international training, international judges. Don Good we had the Missouri State University brought their judging classes up. Uh-huh. Kansas State University, Nebraska, Iowa, all came to KC Shorthorns because they knew we'd have some of the best stock, and I knew what they needed, and we would work back then with the coaches. And that's a lot of those college professors, of course, were judging. So it was very important to me to get my cattle seen before they even went to the shows.
Sure.
There you go.
If I can just step back in there again, we can maybe take this a little bit more chronologically, and obviously in Young Farmers Movement starts, I think, when you're in your early teens and moves through into your middle, late 20s. But you had a mentor of Watt Taylor as one of your mentors. And could you tell me a bit more about him? And there's a lot of Taylors from that area up there. Which family would he be?
Watt Taylor was from Florth. And he was a great guy. He ran a big commercial cattle operation. He had Leicester sheep and Shorthorn cattle at the time. And Meg Taylor his daughter married one of the Andersons, I'm sure, after I left. But one of the Anderson boys, the Shorthorn people from Kerr, I think.
Yeah.
And what taught me a lot about large runs of cattle. He had a place at Troop right in the North Sea. And he ran about 200 commercial cows up there. And that was my first experience really in seeing big numbers of commercial cows wintered outside. And I thought, this has to be better than mucking bios out every day, twice a day. And it sure made a lasting impression on me. John Grant at Skilly Marno, another Angus breeder, spent a lot of time with the Young Farmers operations, and he knew that I was very interested in registered Angus cattle. He spent lots of time with me, tell me about, and his brother, of course, was Donald Grant from New Zealand, who was also a prominent Angus breeder.
Mm-hmm. Certainly both with Scottish connections, the two of those, and been discussed before on this podcast. And going to the shows in your early days, then we're going back to, some of these animals originally, you said about the tractor, but some of these animals would go to the show on foot straight from the farm, wouldn't they? Would that be right?
True. We would certainly drive our cattle to Strickland shows, New Deer shows, Mintla shows, which were local shows about 10, 15 miles apart. And there wasn't any traffic then, there was hardly any cars. So it wasn't too big a job. And I remember at the Strickland show, I'd been showing a young foal for my dad, Clydesdale, and it rose up and clipped me right in the cheek. So they took me to the first aid station and poured a little iodine. Didn't stitch anything up then, just poured straight iodine in there. And we had someone opening that show in there, and that was a hot day, and Harry Lauder it was actually, and he was in there having a dram in the first aid station.
That's what first aid is all about at some of those northern agricultural shows. And some of these you'd go the night before, I guess. If you've got to walk 10 or a dozen miles to get you there early in the morning, you'd go.
Oh, yes. We'd take them the day before. Absolutely.
Yeah, but as a judge, it'd be great to have cattle walk 10 miles before you see them. You'd figure out which ones are sounding not pretty quick, I'm guessing.
That's true, you would. And you'd walk a bit of fat off them on the way, maybe, and the way back, possibly. And yourself.
Yeah. And then at the big shows, when we go to the Edinburgh Fat Stock Show, the Aberdeen Fat Stock Show, we had a train station about a half mile from our farm. And we would put the cattle on the train, take them to Edinburgh and Aberdeen and places like that.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, that was commonplace for Perth as well, and we'll go on to that in a second. But your Scottish young farmers' activities of judging, as you said, and the fitting for showing as well, and that would get you noticed by Alec's Og. And you can tell us a bit about how Alex took you under his wing. You're one of only a handful of people that I know who actually knew Alex Og, and we're actually doing a podcast on him himself in a couple of weeks. We're talking to his grandson, Forbes MacDonald. But Alex is one of those names in the cattle business that was absolutely legendary, and you're a man that got to know him.
Back then, of course, Alec was working for some of the big operations, Dirklick and all these places, and I didn't know him at all. I just knew he was a hell of a good cattle fitter, and I was very fortunate, of course. It was Donald Grant at Skillymarno that wanted me to, sorry, not Donald, John. Donald was in New Zealand, but John Grant was involved in the young farmers and told me that I should go, and he'd get me up there to work for Alec Og, and Alec had just got the lease from Candy Craig on the Baham farm,
sure,
a portion of it. And I'll tell you, Alec was a taskmaster. He come up there with nothing, basically, other than his knowledge in fitting cattle, and he was a master at it. He taught me all kinds of, I'd shown and fitted and clipped a hell of a lot of cattle before that, of course, for people around the area. And then I got to work for Alec, and he put the finishing touches on it. It was all done with hand clippers then, hand shears then.
Yeah.
And I was lucky enough to take cattle to the Smithville. I won the Smithville show. I wasn't champion, but he was a reserve first cross champion in 1958.
Right.
And that was a great experience.
Sure.
And
Gordon, can I ask you a quick question? Didn't Alex hit like the Triple Crown he fit like the Champion International?
That's a little later on. When I went to Strathdown, Alec only had he didn't have very many cows, obviously. He just finished fitting the Smithfield a blue roan heifer he got from Kilhoney up there, and he just won Edinburgh or Smithfield with that. Okay. When I went there about 58 and 57 or 58, and I can remember very well at Candy Craig, of course, did a huge shooting operation. You go out in the dark at 5 o'clock to pick up cabbages for the bulls. Put them in a sack, and that bloody cold water running down the back of your neck with all those getting up in the dark. I'll tell you, you better be wide awake. It was great fun. But when I remember later on, Alec did go to, well, it was he did win at Perth later on.
It was. I'll probably come in on that one, Bob, for your information. And again, we'll pick this up on a later podcast. But yes, I think it was in the middle 60s where he actually won. He won Perth and Palermo and Chicago all in the same year, bringing cattle out, which is a feat that's never been equal.
That's correct.
Probably never will be equal. And that was sort of later times. I'm sure you knew him when he came over to do that. Gordon, and another person that, again, if I count the legends of the cattle show world in the UK, I'd probably come up with 4 names, and the second one on the sheet will be Gordon Blackstock. And again, you fitted cattle certainly at Perth for Gordon, didn't you? When he was at Bapton?
It wasn't not necessarily Perth. It was just helping them at the various shows around. These boys showed at all of the shows, and I was lucky enough to know Gordon. And even when I came here, he stayed with me here so many times, and it was so unfortunate that he passed away as soon as he did. But he had a good connection with a fellow by the name of Wilbur Donaldson at Lueda Farms, and I was fortunate enough when the bull, Bob Adams' bull, Lamb's Benefactor, came along. Okay. We got that bull at my farm here in Kansas City.
Did you? Okay.
Shorthorn operation there.
I'll tell you what, he was just a monster of a cattleman in Canada. And I mean, people would send their children from all over the world to intern and learn from him. I mean, he was the guy. He was really, really well thought of, and he trained so many people. It was unbelievable.
And we're talking Wilbur Donaldson here, yes?
Yep.
Okay.
Well, that necessarily came along with winning. I mean, everybody. It happens when you start winning everything that you get offered all kinds of people from different places. They want to know you've got some secret method. Well, I'll tell you what, when you run into Alec Og, he would have a brush in each hand. That was the secret message. That was the secret. He'd have them all ready better than most people.
I've certainly done some research on Alec, and you said a man that had to, it would give good advice out as well, but he wouldn't just hand it out to anybody, I don't think. And going back again to Gordon Blackstock, of course, would have been at Bapton at the Shorthorns, but I think Blackstock was also involved in Angus as well, but I've seen pictures of him with all sorts of animals. He was a man that knew his stock across the different breeds, wasn't he?
Blackstock, I think he came from Ireland originally, but I'm not sure. But he was a promoter, and he was a goer. The guy never slept very much, I don't think. And he was at Kilrossie before he went to Bapton, and just like most of the guys back then, Gordon Black, and I think he was given the MBE actually for his job that he did with the cattle. And but I had a great connection showing at Perth. I was working with Alec. John Grant of Skillymarno asked me to help him with. He's the one that got me dogs. Help him with setting up a string of bulls for the Perth sales, and getting them ready and everything. So I went down and I clipped them all out. That was the year that Herman Purdy was judging.
Okay, 61.
I went in there and had 3 firsts for John Grant at Skillymarno.
Okay.
Under Herman. And that was a great relationship that struck up. Even he didn't know me and I didn't know him. I knew that, like Alec Ogg had told me, this guy likes perfection in his cattle. Mm-hmm. Don't leave anything out of place. And Alec was showing a bull that he sold for 3,800, I think, called Edwin of Tintoed. He may have picked up from a Derklich cow or something like that. Mm-hmm. That did very well. And John Grant had never had 3 firsts at Perth in his life, and he was so tickled. And that's, if I'd done anything at Perth, that certainly made him happy.
Well, again, you're talking, if I picked out the half a dozen top cattlemen in the world, and we're not talking cattle breeders, but cattlemen, and Herman Purdy, of course, is in that list as well, probably right up there. And to show under him and get it right, you would have to have him brought out well.
I'm just curious, whenever he came over to Perth and he worked so fast in the ring and played so fast, were you guys ready for that? I mean, did you guys know that whenever he started? Did you know that in advance, or did you just kind of get caught up off guard by him going so fast?
I think
I can tell you about Herman Purdy because I won so much under him. It was unbelievable when I look back at some of my catalogs and everything. That Herman was... he liked perfection. He always showed in Scotland, you always showed with a white coat on, collar and tie, and you had your cattle presented properly for him, not for you, but for him. And Alec Hogg had trained me a lot about what time of the day you would be going to ring. Of course, you have to realize the classes were so huge then. Yeah. What you wanted to do was get into the short lead. Mm-hmm. The judge, the classes were so big, they'd be walking around the judge, and he would be pulling what he wanted to save for the short lead. Yep. Getting into the short lead was the key. Then, of course, he shot me up to first right away. I didn't know which end of the damn ring to go to, but there was always assistants there. I was just a kid, you understand. And the next class I went in, I just grabbed the halter of the next bull, and I think I had to get that one ready and in the ring, and I had 3 young bulls in there, get first every time, and that was a great experience for me.
And these would be black cattle. Would they go and be Angus, or would they be for...
Oh, they were Angus. John Grant had a wonderful herd at Skillymarno. Yeah. And, of course, our neighbour was where the Gammer line came from, Sandy Beatty at Banks. So I was surrounded by good Angus cattle when I grew up.
Sure. But Shorthorns is where you would major, and of course you'd show Shorthorn bulls at Perth as well, I guess. And back at one time, the Shorthorn and the Angus would be competing very much against each other. Maybe the Angus would have more of the numbers, but they'd have to split the show up because it just became so many cattle, didn't it?
Well, no, there were so many days for the Angus and so many days for the Shorthorn, of course. Mm-hmm. In Upper Mill, there was lots of Shorthorn breeders back then. Yeah. Jimmy Dunner at Upper Mill, of course, and he was big Shorthorn breeder. Cal Rossi was a little further up. They were at Nig and Inverness-shire. But Watt Taylor, of course, had a Shorthorn herd. He sold most of his bulls at Aberdeen. I'd help him fit his bulls for that. Mm-hmm. Okay. But Blackstock's the one that got me into the Shorthorns, is because he needed a good fitter for this American operation that I finished up with, that I came to in Chicago.
Let's go on to that then. And it was obviously at Perth where these guys caught your eye, and the Canadian cattlemen that we talked about as well. And between Alex Ogg and Gordon Blackstock and Wib Donaldson, they arranged for you to make this move to America, and this was to build a world-class Shorthorn herd, wasn't it, for a very interesting man who had seemingly a lot of money, Gordon?
Oh, yeah. You know, growing up in the north of Scotland, in hard times right after the war, nobody had any money back then. Of course, you have to realize in Scotland, 90% of the people had 10% of the money, and 10% of the people had 90% of the money. So when you hit someone like Otto Gross, who had the biggest cars, the biggest hats, the biggest cigars, and the biggest diamonds, it was just an interesting change. And I really, Blackstock actually flipped a coin between Australia and the United States. I had family in both places, and I was really keen on running a big operation in Australia. And we had a big operation then. You know, there was only 12, 13 million people in Australia back then. And the government would pay your way over there and take over operations in the north of Australia. And a lot of my young friends from the Young Farmers Associations in Scotland at that time went to New Zealand and Australia.
Yeah.
So, but Blackstock talked me in. They paid me pretty well to come over and start this operation for Otto Gross. And Otto Gross was the biggest mink breeder in the world. And he had a son. He was they were close to Chicago, about 30 miles west of Chicago. And he built this fancy operation, and there were a lot of Scots boys there then. And I worked and brought over a lot of young Scots lads to work for me, both at Gross's place and here at Casey Shorthorns.
Okay.
And they're good workers. They were very good workers. They just had a little problem handling a whiskey.
Can I interject a little bit? Because whenever, I wrote that Shorthorn book and stuff, I mean, all through all the universities would all have a Scotch herdsman. I mean, and all these fancy places would have a Scotch herdsman and manager, and you just weren't cool, and you just weren't at the top. If you were a rich person, you weren't at the top of your game unless you had somebody from Scotland managing your cattle. I mean, it was really quite an interesting thing. It kind of put a hurt on the Americans getting some of the better jobs because everybody wanted somebody from Scotland. It was just a status symbol.
Bob, a lot of that would be, of course, because at the time a lot of the good cattle would be coming out of Scotland, and so if they're bringing the cattle out, then to bring a man along with them or a boy along with them from that area, obviously it made sense. But you're right, they certainly had a great reputation in Scotland for producing some iconic stockmen, and hey, they still do.
Well, I'll tell you what, the people that came over on the ships with the cattle, there wasn't many of them that went back. I'll tell you that much. They all got great jobs.
Yeah, and looking back and listening to one of your podcasts, Bertie Rugg was not necessarily. I mean, I never knew him, but I certainly noticed what he could do when he was handling cattle.
Certainly, yeah. Yeah, he was a great cattleman, as was his brother, and in an era when there were a lot of other good cattlemen as well. And of course, he would be round about Alex Ogg's era. And just remind us, Gordon, what year was that when you made that move out to Chicago?
That was the winter of '59. It came to a Letty's terrible snowstorm, and I came to Chicago and had to walk into the operation at Otto Gross's because the roads were all blocked there too.
Home from home, then, eh?
Yeah, exactly. So, but I didn't have to pull neeps. I didn't have to pull neeps and frozen turnips in this country. I was just amazed at the difference. And of course, corn was about $1 a bushel then, and it was a real learning experience for me coming into a new country and start. Of course, I knew all about cattle and working people and things like that because I had some good training working for Alec. You work day and night.
Sure. And Gross himself was probably not a farmer, but a tremendous promoter, wasn't he? Tell us a little bit about what you learned from him in the way that he marketed what he was doing.
I forget how many the thousands of mink he had, and hundreds of thousands. But that fortunately was separated quite a ways from where the Shorthorn operation was. He had set up a place to display his mink along with the Shorthorn in the Shorthorn barn.
Right.
And he would bring tivels in, which is out of Chicago, and we would dress the cattle and hang beautiful diamonds and things like that on the cattle. And he would bring in gorgeous models from Chicago to model his coats and his stoles and all the different things that you make with mink, and floodlights everywhere. And we, of course, had the cattle all ready and prepared, and we had a big staff at the time. And Otto would come in there and he'd feed everyone a big dinner, and these girls would then display his product. And
sounds like a dirty job, but somebody's got to do it, that one.
Yeah. And he wouldn't let those girls go home back to Chicago. He'd put them up in one of the hotels there, and one of my jobs was be sure they eat something. He said, well, hell, they never ate. And that was actually my first experience going with those girls to see that they ate. They only took pills, and some of them took alfalfa pills, which was kind of interesting to me. But anyway, they didn't eat a hell of a lot. I remember that.
Can I tell you,
Otto was just an absolute marketer. He marketed these products all over the world. Fur coats was big then, and he wouldn't do too well today, but knowing him, he'd be into something else.
Sure, yeah.
Can I tell you a really quick story? There I was somehow I met a race car driver, a famous race car driver over here one time. And he asked me what business I was in. He said, well, I was at an auction, a fundraising auction, and there was a woman with a fur coat, and I had bid it up to $10,000 because I thought my wife would really have like that fur coat. And then it turned out they were selling semen, not the fur coat. And he was sure glad he didn't end up with the semen instead of the fur coat he thought he was bidding on. So anyway.
Gordon Gross became ill, didn't he? And I think it's time for you to make a move, and then you moved on to a very prestigious place.
Yes, that was Wilbur Donaldson that handled that transition. He met some other business people here in Kansas City that had a few Shorthorn cattle and hadn't been doing very well with them, and he asked if I would be interested in taking that over.
Okay.
And that's what happened, basically.
That be KC Shorthorns then?
Yes.
Okay. And you became then, the herd became then a force in the shoe ring. For all you say, the cattle weren't that good, but very quickly became a powerful force and won a lot of things there. What would be your big successes when you were there at KC, Gordon?
Well, looking back at it, I'm just kind of amazed at what we did. My brother came over in 1963, and he helped me with the show string. And he was a younger brother, and he hadn't had much experience, but he wanted to come to America, and he's still here, of course. Mm-hmm. But I had 7 international champions in 4 years. Wow. And international show is just phasing out, unfortunately. Mm-hmm. It was kind of the mecca of the cattle breeds and breeders and steers and things like that.
You're talking Chicago International?
Yes. Yeah. And I didn't start showing at Chicago until I was ready that I knew I could win. Mm-hmm. I'd shown at local shows here, but when I started showing at Chicago, the last 4 years of Chicago, I had 7 international champions, not necessarily all grand champions, but they were by a bull I bought from Bob Adam through Gordon Blackstock, Glam's benefactor, who had been champion at Perth. He was a bull by Colrossi Diadem. And he had won Perth, he won the Highland, he won the Royal Show, right. And then he came over here through Canada, of course. John Slee at the Hon handled all of the exports of our cattle, and he was a great bull. He stamped his calves unbelievably. I have so many nice letters from Bob Adam, who could write like better than anyone I ever knew, and beautiful letters from Bob. Congratulating me on all of the winnings that I had done in the U.S. with his bull.
Excellent. Excellent. No, and he was. Bob, obviously, to our uninitiated listener here, we've covered Bob on quite a few of our podcasts, but Bob was renowned as an Aberdeen Angus breeder, but like some of those other great legendary breeders of that time of the 50s and 60s, could breed just about anything if it was, daffodils or budgerigars. But so a lot of people don't really recognise the fact that Newhouse did have a good herd of Shorthorn cattle as well as Angus. And as I said, it was Glam's.
And black-faced sheep, remember.
Black-faced sheep and Border Leicesters.
When I worked for Alec, I'd be sent down there to...
Old Alan.
Yeah, and I'd pick up some black-faced rams for Alec because we ran some sheep up there.
Was it Alec or Gavin? One of them worked for Bob for a while.
Both of them did.
Okay.
Both of them did.
Gordon, in this time period, I have some old Shorthorn magazines, and I pulled out a few from 67, just kind of random. I mean, he has 4-page ads of all these show winners and doing his production sales. And there's in the Herd Book edition, this is a guy that's only 27 years old at this point, and just hasn't been in this country long. And there's a whole feature article written by him on how to run a production sale. So that's not bad.
Still having them, I think. You're still having them, aren't you, Gordon?
Yeah. I wasn't even a citizen then, but I'd been working with. I think by 1973, I had the honor of being elected the Farmer of the Year, the state of Missouri.
Okay.
And I thought I better become a citizen.
And just with those Shorthorns, it was primarily all Shorthorns, I suppose, that you would be working with then. Is there a few bulls that stood out? And Bob, you've got the pictures in front of you, but probably maybe back this one up. Were there a few particular bulls that did the influence to get you to the level you wanted to get to, and bulls that sort of stood the test amongst other breeders?
Absolutely. I had no restrictions on what I was doing. I bought an interest in Bapton Constructor, of course, from Lueda Farms.
Okay.
He was there. Mm-hmm. That bull did a great job. I had a son of Bapton Constructor, and then, of course, we got Glam's Benefactor, he was predominantly a bull that would absolutely stamp his progeny, male or female, and it was easy to win with him. Wow. I was very lucky, and we won everywhere we went, really. But one of the interesting things about winning's easy, I think. When I look back at it, it was a lot of work and a lot of fun. But part of the program, what I remember best was showing cattle at the Denver Stock Show, which basically replaced Chicago at the International, the Denver Stock Show. And John Wayne had a string of Hereford cattle at the time. And Bob, you would remember his operation.
Yeah, in Arizona.
And, we were right across the aisle from John Wayne's cattle with Casey Shorthorn, right across the aisle. Mm-hmm. John Wayne's were in one across the aisle, and I was on the other side with Casey Shorthorn's. And John Wayne would sit on our show boxes, drink our whiskey, and tell everybody how great his Herefords were. And I tell you what, you can't believe the crowd of people that about trampled my poor Shorthorns into the ground to get pictures of John Wayne. That was certainly one of the highlights of showing Shorthorns, being across the aisle from John Wayne's office.
Didn't you have like Tank and Flipper and all kinds of other bulls?
Oh, yes. We I was interested in putting some size back into the Shorthorns. I didn't get along very well with the system was, they were, I called them portable corn cribs. And they couldn't walk. They couldn't walk to save their life, as far as I'm concerned. And the cattle were just too fat. In Chicago, it reminded me of the story my dad said, fat's a pretty color. Well, he'd like to have seen what they were then. They were so damn fat that it just wasn't practical. Sure. So I decided that we're going to change this whole thing. And by winning, if you would look at our cattle, when we won heavily, they were just half as fat as the others. Okay. And Herman Purdy, all the college professors were doing the judging back then. And Herman Purdy was the main judge in the country. Of course, he judged most of the big shows. And he liked cattle that could walk and move. And my cattle were just in good working shape and in perfect bloom all the time. And, of course, we had a lot of hair to work with back then. Mm-hmm. And I'll never forget Charlie Dugan coming in one time and judging on horseback. And Charlie walked the damn cattle, those fat cattle, till they couldn't hardly stand up. They're puffing with their mouths open. And but that really set us up a lot differently than the establishment. And the establishment, but you put your corn through the damn cattle and got them so damn fat. And prime cattle in the United States, and this got me involved with Wilhelm at Iowa State, Dr. Wilhelm, who was interested in performance testing. And the Shorthorn breed was in kind of a lull, a little too short leg. You could stand at the rear end and scratch the ears, really. And that didn't suit me too well because we were in the Midwest. And I always say you have to have people that fit the environment. And we have hot, humid weather here, and your cattle have to, of course, survive walking fair distance to water. And Nebraska, our neighboring state to the north, it's not unusual to see a string of cows walk 2.5, 3 miles for water twice a day. So that always interested me, because winning at the show ring is one thing, but is the operation going to survive down the road in the grassroots? You have to have your bulls able to work in the grassroots level.
Sure. Well, Clipper King of Bampton, didn't he weigh 26.75 or something? He was a big bull.
One of the bulls I used, he was kind of a hybrid, Clipper King. He bred some good ones, and he wasn't as consistent a bull as he'd like, but I was lucky enough to have him to start a pulled herd. And I went to scoured Canada, of course, where there was no showing going on in the remote areas of Canada, and I found a wonderful bull that we called Georgia Giant. He was a son of TPS Cornet leader, Harold Tieman's operation. And that bull was amazing. He was just a tremendous bull. Pole bull, of course, homozygous pole bull.
Well, Bapton would be, if I can just jump in there a second, Gordon Bapton would be recognised, or certainly Gordon Blackstock would be recognised as one of the first men to bring the pole gene back into the UK. But that would probably be before, maybe, I would say, middle 50s, or early 50s even, would he be?
Yes. Gordon brought cattle from Harold Tieman's operation into... Harold Tieman was an excellent breeder than his father. They bred a lot of good polled Shorthorn cattle. They won Chicago a lot. Back then, the polled cattle was shown separately.
Okay.
And today we don't have. They're all together now.
You don't. They're mainly all polled, aren't they, over there now?
Pretty much. No, we still have some horn Shorthorns, yes.
Okay.
But 90% are polled. I mean, it's pretty strictly polled.
Yeah, Bob.
That's right.
Bob would have the numbers there. And if we just move on, time's just lifting on a little bit, but you did, I think when you switched to the performance type of cattle there, the Shorthorn Association were a bit slow to take that up, and didn't you sort of try and wind them up a little bit by putting the, actually, they wouldn't put the weights on your certificates, didn't you wind them up a little bit?
Oh, yeah. The secretary of the association's brother was the secretary of the Hereford Association. I think they set both breeds back 20 years as far as I'm concerned. And that might be a little strong, maybe 10 years, I'm not sure. But, if you don't have a good leader in the business that's looking outside the box to try and keep up with what might be happening around them, you're going to fall behind real quick. And I asked them to do several things. The bylaws said you couldn't show horn cattle in the polled show at Chicago, but the bylaws didn't say you couldn't show polled cattle in the horn side. So I did that, and that teed them off pretty big. And I won with them too, a polled bull. I won with them in the horn class. But anyway, my father and mother were visiting from Scotland, and he got to show that bull. He was so happy and proud that he won in Chicago. And then I said to him, we've got to get into the performance testing. We had Glenn Butt, PRI, Performance Registry International, I think it was called back then. Yep. And the secretary said, no, we're not going to change. So anyway, Alec had taught me about pedigrees, and I could tell pedigrees. And before computers, that was part of being a good cattleman. You put it all in your mind, and you never forgot it. Alec could take you back 5 generations, and any Angus cow in Britain, I think. He was so good, especially if they'd won anything, because he was usually at the end of the halter.
Didn't you like start putting weights on your pedigrees because they wouldn't record weights? And I mean, you did all kinds of stuff, didn't you? You were kind of pushing things.
Yes, I did. I decided that if I can't get the association to change their mind, I'll just put the weaning weight and the yearling weight as the animal's name. And that changed things a little, no question. But I mentioned that after 10 years of winning all the shows in the United States, I was asked to judge a lot of the shows after I retired from showing. And I got interested in Simmental because I had taken Shorthorn females, their first calf heifers actually. I bred them to a bull called Parisian. And I had 9 bull calves and 1 heifer calf. The luck of the Irish.
Okay.
But anyway, that bulls, I was kind of convinced that can these Simmentals handle corn like we have in abundance in the United States? Mm-hmm. So I was pouring the corn to these bulls to see if they would founder. Well, they didn't founder. They only gained over 5 pounds a day.
Right.
And we had Performance Registry International, so the only place I could record them at the time. And these bulls finished up, I made 6 or 7 of them to Blackwatch farms.
Okay.
Because they were in trouble at the time. They weren't able to keep up with all the registrations and everything, and they turned a lot of the cattle into commercial operations in Oklahoma and Texas and Missouri, even in Nebraska. So they got 6 or 7 of those bulls, and then one of them actually was bigger than the rest, and I sent him down to a test station in Oklahoma, and he set a world record for yearling weight. We had just had the world record yearling weight by a Charolais bull, 1,700 and something at a year old, and this half Simmental bull by Parisian set a new record at 1,760 pounds.
Wow. Okay.
A year old, and that was impressive. That sold me that I better get busy in that breed. I went to Denver Stock Show and went to the first meeting of Simmental breeders and joint association, and we were on our way then.
Okay. And did you get involved in importing some of these Simmentals yourself?
Oh, absolutely. I was well acquainted. I'd been to Europe several times, of course, across the Atlantic way over 100 times. And a lot of the times I would go to the Paris show. I'd see those monstrous bulls there. If any of you have been there, it's absolutely amazing. And I went to Germany, Austria, Switzerland, and France. And I knew enough Shorthorn breeders in Canada. We couldn't bring them directly into the United States at that time. We didn't have quarantine stations. Sure. And so we brought them into Canada and through the St. Lawrence River. And I had cattle. The first shipment was an experimental test program by the Canadian government that brought 4 or 5 bulls to their Lacombe University. And I worked very closely with a gentleman by the name of Travis Smith, a wonderful old guy who was a Mormon. And he and I go to Montana and all the different northern states, and he would offer semen from his bull Parisian, and I would offer to buy all the heifer calves that were available from that conception by that bull. And he and I traveled months together from sale barn to sale barn to sale barn all over the north part of the United States. And I contracted so many females we're bringing them into. We'd ran 1,400 head of cows at the time. And moving along on to Texas without even just water them here, feed them, and then move them on to Texas because there's such a demand for the Simmental cattle. Okay. You have to realize at the time, this is so important, Bob, you would remember well, everything was white-faced then. Only problem with a white-faced cow, she didn't milk. And the Simmental bull just fit them beautifully. They give them a lot of size and give them a lot of milk, which they never had, the calves. I can tell you, I've had 100 XIT, 10 in Texas, Hereford cows, and those damn things, they give her calf about 3 sucks and they're on their own after that.
You've just upset a few people there, Gordon.
Yeah, well, they'll get over it. They know what I'm talking about.
Run a commercial herd, I suppose, a crossing to the Simmental rather than the pures. That would become your mainstay, would it? The more the commercial side of it.
No, I was running a purebred. I was running red Simmental operation at the time.
Okay.
Yes, with a big staff, we did everything horseback. Run 1,400 head of cattle all around before the airport went in up here at Kansas City.
Okay.
I had a lot of leased land that we run these cattle on, and it was we were having sales. We did a good job, and then the 80s hit, and the 18 to 22% interest hit.
Yeah,
and that wasn't very nice. That kind of took care of the guys that were leveraged. I'll tell you that. And
we know a bit about that. I had Glenn Klippenstein on the program there, and a similar thing himself would be a similar time, I guess, as well. And Bob sort of explained it to me just how hard that 80s did hit the farming world.
Oh, they're about neighbors, Glenn and Gordon. They're very close to each other.
Glenn's a good friend of mine. Oh yes, good. Yeah. I've known him forever. And
Tom Burke too. They're neighbor Tom Burke's.
Okay.
So yeah, Tom's very close neighbor too. I go by his place all the time, and Tom's done a great job in his business. And of course, I'm on the farm, of course, that Tom worked at. I'm sitting in the same office as Tom used to sit in, J.B. McCorkle's office.
Okay.
Mr. McCorkle was a good friend of mine.
Okay. Certainly, again, he's been discussed on this podcast in the past, but I wasn't aware that that was the same farm. And let's move on, because the time's moving on a little bit there. You got into to make some extra money, I think you got into the sporting clay business and setting up chutes. And is that something that sort of became a natural progression? Or how did that work?
Yeah, no, it was from a lack of money.
Okay.
Very simple. I had to make money some other way than the cattle business at the time. I certainly had all the land. I had the know-how, but I had to make different arrangements. When the bottom fell out of the cattle business, we had to sell cattle, and we were hooked up with the Continental Bank of Illinois. And when even it went down, Illinois with bankers, Stanley Harris, the Kickapoo Farms was a big banking operation. Had his own block, Harris Trust Company. And the Continental Bank ran an ad, said, this is prior to the wreck, of course, if your banker's not able to loan you $1 million, come see me. Well, that was an ad in a farm journal. So the president of the Simmental Association of the company I worked for, he was a fairly good businessman, didn't know anything about cattle, but he knew how to borrow money. So away he went there, and he took him up on his offer. But then when the wreck hit, we were left a little bank.
Can I explain a little bit more on how that bad that got? Because we went from those interest rates, and then there was these tax laws that really favored rich people investing in these purebred cattle, because they could write off everything. And in '86, Reagan changed the tax laws considerably, lowered them greatly, and wiped out all these write-offs. And boy, then things we went out of those high interest, and then all those tax write-offs, and boom, then things really tanked on these high-dollar cattle.
Sure.
Oh, no question. That was an internal thing that happened that took so many of the rich people out of the cattle business. It left more grassroots people that started from the bottom, and that's how I started. I said to myself, this is never going to happen to me again. I'm going to grow exactly as I can afford.
Okay.
And I started working my commercial operation and decided that that's the way I'm going to go, because I'd shown enough, been traveled enough, didn't want to do that anymore. And of course, the shooting thing, both my brothers were in the Scottish shooting team.
Right.
I was on it, and I was on the American shooting team at the time, probably, and then I discovered there wasn't any damn money on shooting. I just as well, and I coached it for a while, international team, but I decided to lay out some sporting clay associations. Shooting became very popular here, and bloodless sport became quite popular, and shooting was part of it. So I was doing very well in the sporting clay courses, and if you look at my ad on that, I traveled from Alaska to Hawaii and put in courses everywhere.
Okay, of sporting clays.
Yes.
Okay. My brother was a big clay pigeon shot. He shot for England, I think. And yes, my brother and my father were both into the sporting clay courses. And you're right. I suppose back in we're talking late 60s, early 70s. My father won any amount of competitions round and about the place there. But yeah, it became a big sport.
No question. But there was no money in the shooting. There was a lot more money in setting up the courses.
Okay.
That suited me fine.
Mm-hmm. And you'd run a commercial herd alongside that, and built that up to what sort of numbers were we looking at when you built your commercial herd of cattle back up, Gordon?
Oh, I started slow, of course. I decided I'm not going to go to the bank and borrow money. I'll just work my way into it as I could handle the operation, and we did. And certainly the money from the shooting thing, I was doing enough that I could expand my cattle operation, mm-hmm. and it grew into about 600 head of cows, right. Which we still have.
Yeah, okay.
We run at 600. I run about 600 head of cows on a commercial operation right here. I have about 20, 30 purebreds that I use for raise my own bulls. I go outside and buy bulls from Dave Nichols up in Iowa. Mm-hmm. Simmental, half Simmental cross bulls usually get a little more stretch and size in the cattle. But I'm not very impressed with what the Angus cattle. Now, you've never asked me this, but when I did judge the tariff show about 5-6 years ago, I couldn't believe the size they've got into the Angus cattle in Britain. Unbelievable.
The town of Tariff, small town that it is, would be the hotbed of most of the pedigree cattle in the country. A lot of them come out of that area, but you're right. Some of those Aberdeen cattle now, Angus cattle, have got themselves huge, and I think one or two are making a little bit to amend that to bring them down the way a little bit, Gordon. But you're right. There's a lot of big cattle about there now, big Angus cattle.
Oh yes, it was. As a commercial man now, grassroots operations, the cattle have to fit the environment. Mm. And those cattle don't fit the environment without somebody bucking feed to them. And that's what you don't want. With corn in this country today, $7 a bushel. When I came here, it was $1 a bushel. And this is the first year I've never creep fed my calves, my fall calves. I run about 300 spring calvers and 200 fall calvers. And those fall calvers came through the winter. The calves came through the winter this year with no creep feed. It's too expensive. Yeah. And I've actually started looking at, because of my purebred Angus herd, I've started reducing the size of my cows a little bit because, again, they have to fit the environment, and they can't fit the environment with $7 corn. Well, they've got purely roughage consumers.
$7 just now, but the way things are on our side of Europe, with wars and things going on there, that and Ukraine being such a big supplier of grain into Europe, that price is only set to rise as well.
Fertilizer.
And fertilizer.
And fertilizer. Yeah.
Fertilizer's crazy. And Gordon, and to make it clear, you're 83 years old, and you do this with one other person. You run 500 cows with one other person.
Wow.
Is you?
Yeah, well, it's easy now, boys. Before about 9 o'clock, you said we're going to get this podcast done. I'd already fed 200 head of cows. And it's so easy now with the kind of equipment we have. I'm totally allergic to square bales. We do everything mechanically, and it doesn't take long.
Okay, and I believe you take in a lot of interns to help them get into the business. Going again, a wonderful trait to put a bit back.
That's my goal, is to start young guys, show them how to go to a bank and borrow money, get started. I make it easy for them. I don't charge them hardly anything for running their cows on my operation. I have a lot of land. I've got about between 3,000 and 4,000 acres of land that I own and lease, and I've started several young, maybe this would be my fourth or fifth one I've started along the way. He now has 50 head, and he's been with me a year.
Okay.
And I don't have to pay them as much that way because things go up and down. Our cattle prices are not very good in this country at this point. I think we're looking at I've been at this for 60 years in this country, and I've seen two highs, and they last about a week and a half.
But Gordon, isn't it so important though? I mean, you are mentoring, and you went through all the people that mentored you. I mean, I just think of all those names that mentored you. I mean, it's a who's who, and now you're giving that back to some other people, and that's a great thing.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yeah, I like doing it, because it was so hard for me to get started without having a father to move my ranch, inherit the ranch. I had to do it from purely out of my back pocket. And there's a hell of a difference between showing cattle for a rich man and working for someone that's rich and signing the checks. Mm-hmm. And then all of a sudden, the checks are your responsibility, and the feed is your responsibility, and the vet bills are your responsibility. And that's all the things I have to teach these young lads, how to not spend money on anything else. Don't buy land and invest your money up in land if you can lease it. Mm-hmm. And I've leased land most of my operation has all been on leased land. Okay. And it works fine for me.
It is a brilliant thing, as you said, and the transition from pedigree stockman working for a wealthy outfit to running their own herd, which is obviously the way that you've got to, is it's quite a rare beast. That there aren't too many of those that. Obviously, Alex Ogg was one of those, but there aren't too many of those that transgressed from stockman to breeder.
I always say, if you want to make $1 million in the cattle business, start with 2.
That's very helpful.
Dave Nichols claims that I am one of half of 1% that survived and still in the cattle business after 60 years. I've known Dave for 60 years, and that's what he always tells me.
A great mentor as well, and great advice. And David has been another one that's been on this program, and we really enjoyed having him on. As with yourself, Gordon, we've really enjoyed having you on. Have you got a few more stories from us, maybe back in Scotland, to some of our Scottish people? I know you said you've been shooting over here a few times, Gordon, so tell us a bit about that, maybe.
Well, yeah, the Duke of Fifes, at least the Duke of Fifes estate 1 year to stay with my group. I take my family back every year. I can remember the year I judged the Turf show. I brought the whole family back there, and Alec Salmon was the number one guy at the time. Mm-hmm. And of course, he came to meet us all at the airport and got his picture with my hat on in the front page of the Press and Journal. He needed all the help he could get.
Did.
I think.
He did. I'm not sure you helped him that well. He fell from favor just after that, but there you go.
Can I ask a question? Yeah, exactly. Because you have Gordon, you also have some beautiful art, Highland art, too, don't you? Quite a collection. I mean, I love livestock art, and especially 19th century livestock art. You've collected quite a bit, haven't you?
I do. I've been in the sporting business all of my life, and if I see a good piece of art that I like, I'm lucky enough to have quite a number of 1850s oil paintings, mm-hmm. Both of Highland cattle and of sporting events that anyway, but that's kind of a sideline that I was able to do and get, and quite proud of them. I'd like to sell them all and just put what I get for them on the wall, because I've looked at them for a hell of a long time. I think the money'd be better than looking at them anymore.
Gordon, you mentioned a name earlier on, Blackwatch Farms, and I don't know if you know, but I wrote a book about Jack Dick and his antics. In fact, Bob and I are going to do a podcast on him just shortly. And of course, there's another man that appreciated his sporting art, mainly horses, I know, but I think they very nearly bankrolled him out of what he needed by surprise.
Oh yeah, Jack was a character, of course, and he changed everything in Scotland when he started throwing that money around, and it was a shame. It was a bit of a Ponzi scheme, It was a bit of a pyramid program he had invented. And he had all these people in Scotland calling their bulls by Jewish names, if you remember. And it was really comical because they latched on real quick to the program. And I look back now and see Bob Animal. He come up with all those names where he's Jew this, Jew that, and they snapped him right up. And the program initially was not bad. I mean, you buy 5. He sold 5 heifers for $10,000, and whatever the bull was, he put with him. And it started off then, and he only had about 50 clients total. And he got on a big board, in the New York Stock Exchange. I can remember when it went down. That was amazing and a disaster for a while. But it's not unusual for when cattle are high, and people get a program going to see crooks come out of the woodwork. I've seen it, and not just smart enough to follow what they do all the time, but it does still happen all the time.
Certainly, he's an interesting example of that, and as I said, Bob and myself will be discussing him in a week or two there, and something I found quite fascinating for all the wrong reasons, really, but interesting character. And I think we've taken enough of your time there, Gordon. I know you said you've been out and fed a couple of hundred cows already this morning, an admirable effort for a man of your years, but I think we've...
Well, I appreciate being on it. Yeah, I thought I would just finish by saying, for any young lad that's listening, I said to myself, find a banker that understands cattle. Don't go to a city banker, because you don't know what the hell he's talking about. Find somebody that has a farm and has a few cattle, and also has a bank. Don't ever be afraid to fail. After the wreck of the 80s, I felt I would never let that happen to me again, and only grow at the rate you can afford.
Sure. Wise words.
Keep in mind that everyone likes to eat beef.
Yeah.
That's I can remember when I was judging the tariff show, I said, it's not hard to judge these cattle because they're all green. That's what we're looking at. We're not looking at red, black, spotted, or anything else. It's all about money. Mm-hmm. And if they don't make money for you, you shouldn't be in the business.
Fair enough. I don't think that probably applies to everybody in the pedigree business, but in the cattle business in general, you couldn't get wiser words than that one. That's for sure.
And you have also been a great example of who you surround yourself with is so important. Mm-hmm. And you've surrounded yourself with a bunch of great people. I think Andy has. I sure have in my years, and boy, it makes all the difference. And gosh, you're one of the best examples of that I've ever seen, of surrounding yourself with the right people, and that is a big part of being successful.
Yeah. Okay. I mean,
don't forget, I've got bulls for sale all the time.
Purebred Angus.
All right.
Well, that's really good to hear from you, Gordon, and from you, Bob, as well, for coming in on this call, because I know you guys knew each other. It's been fascinating to hear that, to hear a story of a Scotsman who made his mark on both sides of the Atlantic. You're a rare beast there, Gordon.
Yes, thanks very much.
Well, it's been fun.
Okay. Thank you for listening to this week's Top Lines and Tails podcast, again kindly sponsored by Harbro, suppliers and manufacturers of quality livestock nutrition and nutritional advice, and of course other agricultural inputs as well. And during these uncertain times of spiraling input costs and volatile markets, why not have a word with Harbro and discuss your feeding plans either directly with them or with your local representative, who of course can be found on harbro.co.uk's webpage or on social media such as Facebook and others. And you can, of course, find Top Lines and Tails on social media, on Facebook, Twitter, and various other places. And on Facebook, you will find some photographs, hopefully, to back up this and other episodes.